You're ready? Okay. Let's get started then. Welcome and good morning. I would like to call the meeting to order, the meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board, and give an overview of the public comment process first. We will take written questions and comments throughout the meeting. Just follow your instructions on your screen and on the meeting notice. We will start with the roll call of the members to establish a quorum. I'll start with Tanya Heikela since Virginia Dale is not available today. You don't have to do anything.
You just wait a second. Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Tom Holzer is also not available. Diane?
Diane McKnight, no new declarations.
Anna?
Anna McCulloch, no new declarations.
Bob?
Bob Nyman, no new declarations.
Obi is has a virtual presence. He's online. Obi?
Yeah, and Sekar, no new declarations.
Penny Rose is also not available today. Lisa?
Lisa Wanger, no new declarations.
And I am Inga Werner, and I have no new declarations either. So first, I'd like to give an overview of the agenda. We will discuss our reviews and activities, including a debriefing on the public field tour and the Bay Delta Science Conference, which was this week. We will also get a presentation and discuss the Council's Tribal and Environmental Justice Issue paper. We will also discuss the Climate Science Symposium prospectus that is part of your package. That's pretty much it. Are there any public comments?
There are none.
Right. So agenda item 2 is my report and business matters. So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone to today's meeting at the Ride Hotel in the Delta. And this is the first time of the board to be here since 2017. I think we are all new members since then. So I will turn it over to the hotel chef who will give us a little bit of background on this place.
First of all, welcome to the Historic Ride Hotel. If you're not familiar,
Just one second, your mic, I think, has a problem, right?
Okay.
It wasn't you.
Welcome to the Historic Ride Hotel. For those who are not familiar, there has been a hotel here since 1886. What you see currently is the new Ride Hotel, which is closing on September 2027. There's been a long history in the Delta. We welcome you. We have a rich history with celebrity and questionable behavior, prohibition. We have a speakeasy downstairs. And thank you for understanding that we're upgrading the hotel. We look closer, we have new paint, but I don't have baseboards yet. Fans are coming, upgrades are being made, but it's being a little slowly here. So if anybody would like to cheer later on, the garden is open, there are people running around, and again, just welcome.
Thank you so much. We're thrilled to be here. It's definitely a beautiful place. So let's move on. Next thing is I will be attending the council's November 21. Well, oh, November 21st, sorry, wrong year, meeting where I will introduce myself to the council as the new chair of the Delta ISB. And I'm sorry, I'm rustling with paper because I have some technical issues with my laptop. And Dr. Nyman will join me to present on the food webs review that day. We are also planning to review and comment on the draft Delta Adapts adaptation plan and are waiting for the public release. As a reminder, Obi will take the lead to draft the comment letter. In terms of new products, since our last meeting, we finalized the comment letter on the final EIR for the Delta Conveyance Project and submitted it to DWR on September 20th, 2024. A copy is in your meeting package. We found that although some minor changes were made in response to our comments, the responses generally did not lead to meaningful changes to the EIR for the Delta Conveyance Project. And the Delta ISB stands by many of its original concerns of the draft environmental impact report. We hope our comments will be useful to DWR as the process moves forward. There was also a matching workshop for the next California Sea Grant State Fellow in September 16th to 18th. Dylan Chappell, Shoko Shinbrod, and Margot Matson participated in the matching process. And I will turn it over to Dr. Chappell now to provide an update on the matching process. Dylan.
Chair Warner, provide a very brief update on our matching process. We interviewed 16 excellent candidates. For those of you who've interacted with our Sea Grant Fellows in the past, you know that it's always a great crop of people to choose from. For these, we are in the process.
Much for your efforts, Dylan. I know it's a lot of work from participating in it last year, and it's always hard to pick your best candidates, but I'm sure you have found a good person. I don't think we received any public correspondence since the last meeting, so that's still true. All right. Are there any public comments?
There are none.
All right, we move on to agenda item 3. We will have a discussion on the Climate Science Research Symposium. And so I'll just give a little bit of background for those who haven't heard about it yet. The Delta ISB plans to organize and host a public symposium in early 2025 on the current state of climate science. Sorry? No, it's glitched. On the current state of climate science and to understand how organizations in the region are considering climate change. The Delta ISB will discuss the draft prospectus for the symposium today. Based on the discussion, ISB may take action on the next steps on the prospectus, such as circulating it for public comments. I will turn over to Obi to provide an overview of the perspective. Obi?
Yeah, Inga, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. And I'm glad, by the way, if there is any background noise, I apologize. But as I present this, and obviously Anna is my colleague on this project, and I will ask her to chime in as after I finish this description of the prospectus. And I want to thank the ISB staff and Edmund and others for assembling this prospectus. And I think it is in pretty good shape. I have some comments on it. So let me go through the prospectus, and as I speak, if Edmund can scroll, that will help. So as you all know, all around us, around the globe and also in the US and in California, we have seen extremes on both sides, very wet periods and dry periods. And, the recent example of what happened in Hurricane Helene in Florida, Georgia, and particularly in North Carolina is a good example of what possible or potential happen. So it's important, we feel that the board to understand this rapidly evolving science of climate and climate projections and also how the agencies are using them for planning. And this is particularly important because we have learned a lot from the DMDU review. And I feel like this is a next logical step. If you can scroll, Edmund. So our goals is primarily, number one, to understand the current climate projections and also the uncertainties. And the number two, the second objective is to understand how the organizations in Delta are considering the climate change. And these, both of them are important for us. As I mentioned, the science is rapidly evolving, but we need to understand what's the current state of science by inviting experts who have worked on this, particularly in the Delta region. So there are some topics that we have identified. Number one, what are the important climate drivers for planning under future conditions? I will mention some of them in a minute. So, and the other thing is, are we observing changes outside the natural variability in these drivers already? So we want to understand that. Number two, what are the current projections of various climate scenarios? We're talking about the role of atmospheric rivers and others, sea level rise, and understand the range of uncertainties in the future. Number three, perhaps this is something maybe we need to word it differently. What changes in the drivers are the result of climate change? I think maybe that wording to a change, I would like to call it change it. Number four, droughts are also very important. And as you know, we may have increasing mega droughts in the future in the region. But more importantly, that may result in particularly under warming conditions, increasing frequency and magnitude of fires in the tributary watersheds. And that itself will change the rainfall runoff response of the tributary basin. So we want to understand that. Number five, we are also very interested in compounding effects of these extremes. Sometimes the compounding effects, even if they are not extremes, could lead to an extreme impact in the region. The number six is we understand these global climate model projections are, have very high, very low resolution. And that's, we eventually or essentially use downscale climate data. And we want to understand what are the best available downscale climate products. And finally, we want to understand how organizations are using them. And I understand, at least attending the conference, I saw some presentations where some of the, recent work, they're trying to use climate projections and so forth. So those are the objectives we have. If you can move down a little bit. Our audience is primarily, obviously, the board itself and the public and maybe our partner agencies and other agencies in the region. So we will invite the public to this planned symposium. If you could move down a little bit. So what is our expected outcome? So it's basically to increase the current understanding so that we are all on the same page. What's the best available climate science information? And then, we will prepare a summary memorandum of events and key takeaways like we have done for other workshops. And we'll probably check with Marvin's notebook to see if he can prepare a proceedings report on that. So the time frame for this symposium. If you go down a little bit, Edmund. So October, we are trying to release the draft prospectus maybe after the meeting today, depending on what we decide. On November, December, finalize the prospectus. December, we will start contacting some of the speakers and experts that we want to invite. In January, we will open the registration for the workshop, and March, we plan to hold the hybrid event in March, and in May sometime we will release the summary memorandum. So that's the plan we have. And summer and early 2026, we will work on a manuscript for that. Now, I don't want to go through the rest of it in detail, but I want to mention there is a lot of work underway already. And I think there's a list of them in this prospectus already. For example, California climate change assessment. That's a nice exercise across the country, actually. They are focusing on California, similar to IPCC, that I haven't seen any other state in the country. Then there are many other events that have taken place. State of Bay Delta Science, ecological program of climate change, work team effort, climate change vulnerability assessment. So I think one of the things I would suggest is maybe we need to summarize what's going on in these other events so that we don't duplicate the efforts and we can learn from what has been done already. And I think that's all what I have. I don't know if Anna has anything she wants to chime in and contribute.
I'm hoping everybody had a chance to read the prospectus, the draft prospectus, because now we should discuss what's in it and ideally make a decision of how to move forward with it. So do you have any comments here? Comments? Anna?
You just really
Just to add to what Obey said, and thank you, Obey. That was a really great summary. I just wanted to thank again the staff for helping us put this together and updating it. I think when we talked about this prospectus last time, the main discussion was to what extent we wanted to stick really to comment projections versus really thinking about the management implications. And so that is a more nuanced discussion in the current draft. So that might be one topic that we talk about. And then potentially whether there is appetite for writing this sort of perspective piece that is described here that wasn't there before. Those are the two things that I think are the major changes from last time.
Follow up
a product.
a product.
Yeah.
From this. Yeah. All right. Lisa, you wanted to say
A
something?
few comments. I really like this prospectus a lot. I think this science to management connection probably is something that we can do. It's in our wheelhouse to try to make those connections as opposed to just reviewing the science. So I do like that idea, although I understand there's a limit on how much you can get done in any one workshop. I think the other thing I particularly appreciate is the focus on looking at the range of uncertainty and appropriate downscaled products. One very minor critique is the use of the word best in question 6. I think it's important that we recognize, you could have multiple models that could still be useful. A comparison across multiple models can be useful as opposed to picking one best. And so I would suggest maybe an alternative word there. But in terms of the science management connection, one thing I'm thinking about is what we're hearing, what we learned at the science conference and in conversations related to the DMDU project was that it's hard to change models. And so there are things embedded about how the system works in the models that don't get updated. And so I think it could be an interesting conversation of how to deliver the science in a way that enables these changing processes in the system due to climate change to get implemented. And I don't know exactly what that looks like, but maybe there's a way to add just a little bit more language about, in question 1, you talk about, are we observing changes in these drivers already? And how will droughts change in the future? I think we could think about taking it one more step in terms of what does it take to incorporate that knowledge in the models, what kind of products would be useful or what kind of meetings might be useful, just as a way to keep that translation going.
Other comments?
I have a comment. And I was going to comment about how this idea of the projections and the range of uncertainty, one of the management connections is what is being projected about the new scenario that is useful for management. So what kind of information about a projection is needed for agricultural questions, rice versus corn? What projections are needed for understanding, will there be massive HABs in the future? What needs to be projected relative to the stability of the levees? These aren't necessarily all the same across the board. So we could pose that in a way that not going all the way of management, here's what needs, the models say this is what needs to be done, but what are how that might vary across issues, what's needed. So here, we learned about these how important it was for these strains of rice to be developed by UC Davis to be able to convert to rice and stabilize the subsidence. Will new rice strains be needed? So if the projections might need to provide information to be useful, those projections might need to be a little bit more detailed, and those details may vary. So, so that's kind of a going halfway, maybe, in this context. That's a suggestion.
Yeah, Inga, can I just chime in a little bit? Oh, is that okay? Can you hear me okay? Inga, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. I think both Lisa and Diane made some good points. I would like some clarity from the board on few things. I think about this in some logical way. First, we want to understand what drivers in terms of climate and related events will have, impactful outcomes, right? So I want to understand, for example, atmospheric rivers, the droughts, and some other implications of changing climate. But then we also have what I call downstream effect. What are the impacts on the ecology and other areas that are driven by these changing drivers? And that may be where what Dan is talking about. What is useful to us in terms of projections and what needs to be incorporated into the model, because that's what lead to the impacts of the system. And finally, how management implications could be connected to those, not only the changes in the drivers and the other impacts, and then put those into the model. And so I want to know, is that the complete scope that we are going to cover, or are we going to sort of limit, given the time frames, to some of those things? Right. That's all I wanted to say.
All right. Bob had something to say.
I'd like to follow up on I think it would be Diane's comments a little bit. First of all, I think this is a great idea. I think it's absolutely needed, and it's very timely. And the one thing I would say is having somebody, or maybe it's more than just somebody, it's maybe a couple of people, towards the end, that can not only summarize the information out of the symposium, the key points out of the symposium, but also think about what climate change, what are some of the opportunities that might arise out of climate change? So, what are the positive things that can be done? there's a potential whenever we discuss climate change, it seems like we always tend to focus on this, that, or the other thing, but it kind of dashes hopes, people's hopes for the future, that things are going to change so much that, where is their place in a future world, as opposed to saying, yes, things are going to change, but here are the opportunities of that that are coming out of that change, where environmental conditions, might be better, or social conditions might be better. What are the practical steps that one might take in order to make it a more just and viable world going forward, even though it's different? And having somebody at the end that can bring all of that together, and that's a big job, but bring all that together so that at the end of the symposium, you walk out of the room and you've got at least a few nuggets of how to move forward in a very positive way. And to me, that's essential, that you've got to walk out of the room, believing that the future is viable, other than that the change is going to be so big and massive and going in directions you don't want it to go, that you walk out and you're kind of slumped over. But, walk out of the room believing you actually can influence the future in a good way.
Can I ask, and sorry, I'm going to not look at you as I talk because otherwise the mic won't work. A clarification question. Do you mean having someone who can speak to identifying and scaling solutions in response to the changes in climate that we anticipate, or strategies for adaptation to the changes that we anticipate? Or do you mean actually identifying positive outcomes of the changes that we anticipate? So, under future climate conditions being more amenable for some positive outcome? Because I think the former is certainly something that one could include, and that is quite often included in these types of examinations of climate change. I'm not as sure about the latter, but I wasn't sure which one you meant.
And I'm not sure. You might have to clarify what's number one and what's number two.
Well, number two is, number one is climate is changing. As a result of that, there will be ongoing rapid changes to the system that will lead to challenges. But here are ways that we can develop solutions to these challenges. Here are ways that we can adapt to these rapid changes. Essentially, how do we best cope and create opportunities given that? The second would be, and I'm sort of cartoon example, lo and behold, we can now grow wine in northern Alberta, right? Well, obviously we're not looking at Alberta, right? So the second one is that arguing that conditions will actually be more favorable for X, Y, or Z under an altered climate relative to today. And I wasn't sure which of those. So one is more about adaptation and mitigation, and one is more about improvements resulting from the changed conditions.
Okay, perhaps to answer your question, Anna, I guess I was feeling, I'm not sure I'm thinking fully yet, but I'm feeling that, adaptation of, how do we adapt going forward in positive ways. I've had this discussion on the side with a couple of people. I sort of feel like people are looking for projects, they're looking for solutions, they're looking at things that they can put on the ground, to do this and do that and so on. Whereas I'm thinking more and more that instead of having these, agencies come up with these projects in a way that they can say, I did this or I did that, is that we think about, for example, things like resiliency. How do we build resiliency within our communities, within our culture, and so on? Because we don't exactly know what those changes are going to be precisely. But if we have a culture that can adapt to change and have the resources that are needed to adjust to that change, that gives me hope that, there's good people and good thinkers out there and so forth, and we can move wherever we need to go. And if we can have a speaker at the symposium who really addresses how culture needs to adjust as we move forward, and what are some of the practical things we might do, I think I would walk out of there feeling pretty good about the symposium, as opposed to growing wine in Alberta, or, something like that we should start planting vineyards in Alberta. You know what I mean?
Okay, so I would put that in the first bin, which is a bin that Obe can speak up, but I feel much more comfortable including as well. And I really like this theme of resilience, which is coming up more and more. And I think we could more explicitly even use that verbiage in prospectus. I don't know, Obe, if you had some thoughts, but
I do. I think, Tom, I think you're making some good points, and we typically look at negative impacts of these drivers in the future, but I think you're suggesting don't just look at the negative. There might be some positive changes that might be beneficial to us. For example, if you're going to have a better future, maybe for water supply, that might not be a concern, if I understood you correctly. And the second aspect is, I think this idea of basically looking at something like dynamic adaptive pathway strategies, look through the whole future and make sure you are not preempted from having resources to adapt to those changes in the future. I think, if I understood you correctly, but I think we will incorporate your suggestions into the prospectus.
Tanya? No? Okay, well, I was just thinking while you were saying that, Anna and Obi and Bob, I was thinking maybe a follow-up workshop would be warranted for this, as I understand it, this is like a one-day workshop, right? A symposium planned where you want to get an overview of what's going on, how people incorporate this into their management decisions, etc. So, if you can go to the positive side, wonderful, but also maybe think about another symposium, in the second part of 2025 that focuses on the solutions, on adaptation, on that kind of thing. It's a big area, I think. Yeah. I heard from colleagues that their institution is hiring like 5 professors to just focus on climate adaptation, cluster hire. So maybe that would be a good idea. I see a lot of people not. Tanya.
I'll just, echo a little bit what you've already said. I do think what we have, this list of 7 bullet points is broad. It's going to take a lot. We may not even get to all of them. I do think point number 7 on how organizations in the Delta are integrating climate projections into planning could be one where we start to tee up that second round of conversations by asking, and how are they thinking about resilience in that process? And what are some of the kind of adaptation or resilience strategies? But there, Inga, you're right, there's a large kind of scientific community around the idea of resilience, and how do we build it into cultural and institutional and organizational systems, but also then how does that connect with the broader biophysical changes that are happening? And so I think the resilience question is big and could eat up quite a lot. Unless we want to just, again, tee it up and think about it as a kind of a transition point into a second half-day workshop or something like that. But I like that point, Bob. And I do think, we have to be careful about not trying to do too many things and then not getting enough in depth on any of these things. And that's just my main kind of concern right now. So, and Diane has another comment.
I would
get back to a point I was making earlier about resilience again, where the models connect with resilience is what are the nuts and bolts of what's being predicted. Because if they're in the past, at least for my understanding of projections for aquatic ecosystems, there's often a mismatch between what's being predicted, like air temperature, which doesn't actually control the temperature of streams. And you need to know the temperature of streams. That's driven by sunlight in order to know how the fish will do. So sometimes there's just needing more communication about what the models will tell you, or however uncertain it is. And then I have a second point I wanted to make. Most recently at the European Geophysical Union, last spring, I attended sessions about climate change projections, and some of those projections included not just the business as usual or some projections about we decrease our CO2 emissions, but actually looking at timeframes for which how does it matter if there's a reduction or even a going carbon negative in 10 years or 20 years, or a more optimistic range of activities related to greenhouse gases that were being presented as part of these models. And that gets at Bob's point, which is getting another way of dealing with the pessimistic assumptions that we're just going to keep going. And they were really fascinating projections that I think are useful to have in mind as well.
So Diane's triggering some thoughts for me too. So, I think, of course, there's a sequence of events. The climate drivers go into a whole series of models that then give us various ecological outcomes. So I think what you're saying is it's important to have some of those modelers in the room so they're getting what they need to make relevant projections. But another thing that just occurred to me, and this is related to a presentation that Laura Larson made at the science conference, is that many of us modelers are trying to create future weather that looks different from historic weather. And a key question that she delved into was whether you could sort of randomly pick from a distribution of events and generate future weather. And many people were uncomfortable with that because of the temporal autocorrelation of weather. And I think that might be a science topic that could be appropriate here, of understanding what's a good way to project futures so that they go into models. And that might move us toward Diane's question without necessarily getting into all the modeling that would be needed. So just a thought.
I have some follow-up comments, if it is okay. I think Tanya and even Diane, I think they alluded to some important issues. Number one, we had to make sure we get something out of this. We don't want to broaden the scope so much that we don't get some key outcomes out of this discussion or symposium, I think. So we have to be careful in limiting the scope, but at the same time, talk about important issues that were just discussed and identify for any particular, maybe follow-up meeting or symposium. So I feel like we need to understand what are the important drivers, how they might be changing. But I think in particular, around the Bay Delta region, we are not trying to solve the global problems in this discussion. What is the best understanding of these global changes to our region? I think particularly frequency and magnitude of atmospheric rivers, the mega drought, and this is why I'm still uncomfortable just adjusting the historical traces like we pointed out. It doesn't allow you to understand this changing frequency of extremes because you're just using the historical traces. I mean, this resampling from the distribution, I think Lisa rightly pointed out, you're not getting that temporal sequencing issues that I'm talking about. So I think that should be a discussion. Is that the best way to do this? Or is there any other way to use this climate scenarios or projections in impact assessment. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Obi. Anna?
Just briefly, it is just a one-day workshop, as we have to be careful about keeping topics within a certain range. But I think the last topic that Obi just discussed, and if I think to the topics that Diane brought up, really, they're all about how do we make the tools that we have available, like the modeling tools, as useful as possible for the applications that are needed in order to ensure a more resilient future, right? And that may be, you know, I can only do so much with air temperature and with projected mean annual precipitation, because that's not super relevant to day-to-day management. And so I think all of this, we don't have to necessarily be too prescriptive, but this theme of how do we make the tools more useful for actual application sort of encompasses a lot of what we've been discussing.
Yeah, so I think, and there were a lot of decision science talks at this conference, which helped crystallize some ideas. And one of the ways that a presenter put this was identify the types of uncertainty that are decision relevant. So.
Any other comments?
Oh yeah, it's just to respond to Anna. Based on the discussion, if we want to do a 2-day workshop or a 3-day workshop, or it could just be one day, but I just want to make sure like you're aware that we could potentially have more than a day. We have a public comment too, when you guys are ready.
Briefly, if we were to have a longer workshop, I actually really like the idea that some people have brought up of maybe having a break between the first half and the second half, i.e. having 2 separate events, because I suspect that what we hear more from the science side may actually inform what we want to hear more on the second half. And I think sometimes people are also more likely to be engaged if it's a relatively finite total duration. And people can pick and choose a little bit, but thank you for putting that on the table, Edmund.
Yeah, you know, if I can chime in, sorry. I think I agree. I feel like one day, given what I just heard, might not be enough. And I feel like maybe we need to have a 2-day workshop, so we have enough discussions with the people who are going to speak and contribute to. So I feel like maybe it has to be a 2-day, when even in 2 days, we might not get to all what was just discussed. 1 day seems too short for what we just to get and cover even the surface of what we just discussed.
That is there now, but have a 2-day symposium workshop. Is that what I hear from you, Obi?
Yes.
What do you think about that, Anna?
Let's chew on this a little bit. I think that either could work. My inclination is if we're going to have 2 days, maybe 2 one-day events that are spaced out a little bit might be the way to achieve that goal.
Yeah. There was another question about the product. Should we discuss that, or
so when we discussed this at the last meeting, one of the ideas that came up is whether we want any product to come out of this beyond a summary by the board and potentially the Maven's notebook. Sorry, I'm misquoting the name. Maybe, oh, that's right, Maven's notebook. I'm a big fan if we're going to invest the amount of time it takes to plan this and to attend this and to really think about what our takeaways are, to actually put that into a product that is more easily and broadly publicly accessible. And so this idea of a perspective piece that could be published somewhere, or an editorial, or something that would be more easily findable by a broader community could be something that we would do. Of course, the challenge there is that it's always requires more effort and someone has to take the lead and actually write it. I don't personally feel like we need to necessarily 100% commit one way or the other. And the way that it's written into the prospectus now, it's left as and we may also do X. So from my perspective, I'm comfortable with the way that it's written in the current version. But it's also partially a question because I've only been on the board for 2 years, but that's not a model that we have tended to follow, to have a more, some sort of written product that is published in some existing journal or newspaper, online blog, whatever it may be, beyond the internal report. So there may be procedural reasons we don't do that, in which case people should chime in. But I'm just thinking about if we take the time and the effort to do this well, how can we maximize the benefit for a broader community in terms of what we learn as part of the process?
Is that in the past, the board has done what you're talking about, have articles that are out in the broader published literature. There's, since I've been on the board, there's been the pandemic and other issues related to how we were being supported and such. So that certainly would be, in my opinion, a good avenue to pursue.
With that, I think if you put in all this effort to have a symposium, it would be really great to give an opportunity to the wider audience to see the outcome of it. And I mean, there are, journals that are more localized to this area, the San Francisco SJ, right? That would be maybe a good place for something like that, But yeah, I would be all for it, but ultimately it depends on having the time and putting in the effort to do it, because it's always a lot of work.
There are also, and I have not published in these venues before, but I've been thinking about increasingly over the last few months, places like the Medium or the Conversation, which are online platforms that tend to reach a broader spectrum of interested parties beyond the scientific community. And so those could be other types of avenues that we could explore in principle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, just to chime in, I really like the idea of having a publication out of it at some point. I also think, there aren't very many assessment of large scale systems like the Bay Delta region. It might be of interest to global community as well. So I think we can think beyond even the local publications and, depending on, what we get out of this effort, it might be worthwhile looking more globally rather than just regionally. Of course, it'll be available to regional, folks of regional, having a regional interest.
So we do have a public comment that we could take right now.
Yeah, so online we have one from Morgan Chow, and just a reminder for folks in the room, if you have a public comment on any agenda items, feel free to line up at the microphone, but we'll take Morgan first. Morgan, you should have the ability to unmute your microphone. Feel free to introduce yourself to the board before providing your comment, but that's optional. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Edmund. And yeah, good morning, board. I'm Morgan Chow. I'm a manager in the planning division at the Delta Stewardship Council. You heard from me and my colleagues a few meetings ago about our Delta Adapts work that is very close to having a public draft of our draft adaptation plan. And yeah, I just wanted to comment on this discussion. I think that it I just in the vein of thinking about modeling that are useful for the applications needed, as a few board members mentioned in the plan that we have are very close to having a draft of, which I know you haven't seen yet, but we have proposed actions and several of them note the need for improved modeling or better projections and just just more information that improves our decision making according to flood risk, climate smart agriculture, water supply, and restoration in the Delta. So I just thought that it could be a cool connection for how the council is thinking about adaptation planning and how the ISB is conducting this symposium to pull from some of our proposed actions and maybe how these symposium topics are organized. So someone brought up an example about transition from rice to corn. We talk about like crop choices for agriculture for farmers in the region. Our process for this plan was we really did reach a very diverse group of adaptation practitioners working like locally at cities and counties, but also statewide, as well as a lot of the populations in the Delta that will be impact and are already being impacted the most by climate impacts. So that includes growers. We met with like 7 different groups of growers, as well as some of the region's most vulnerable communities. So I thought that could be a nice connection to make. I know you haven't seen it yet, and it would be just a draft that we would be putting out hopefully soon. So that might not align with the timeline, but I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Much, Morgan, for that input. I don't see any raised hands at the moment. So, Bob. Oh,
I just have a practical question about when Obe and Anna would like to receive suggestions for speakers. It seems to me that, for example, I'm curious about who might be a speaker from the environmental organizations, from tribal communities, other groups. So anyway, getting some indication of, when you would like to see suggestions for speakers, let us know.
I think if I can respond, I'm glad Bob brought this up. I think we need to get suggestions. We have a preliminary list, and I have about 5 people. Maybe it'll really be good for us to start assembling a list of suggested speakers and ideally identify what they would speak about, between now and next month, when we are supposed to finalize some of these things. By December, it'll be good for us to ask the entire board or even outsiders who they would suggest. And obviously we might not be able to get everyone to speak, but at least we have a list to select from.
just send in suggestions to you. All right. Yeah, if you have any suggestions, send them to Anna or Obi.
I send them to Edmund.
Oh, to Edmund. Okay, to Edmund. So where are we? First, my question to Anna and Obi, do you feel like you would like to go over the prospectus one more time, or do you think it reflects what was discussed today?
I think there's I don't think there are really big substantive changes that need to be made, but there's certainly some terminology that was used in some of the questions and some of the discussion today that I think are very good. So I think at a minimum, I'd like to have the opportunity to tweak the wording here and there to include some of the concepts that Dan talked about, to include explicitly the concept of resilience a little bit more, and a few of the other themes. I jotted down some notes. I see other people were jotting down notes as well. And so I'm so perhaps Obe and I could take our notes from today's discussion, make a few additional changes, and then release the prospectus after that. I'm not sure if that would require a vote.
Yes, it would. So if Obi, do you agree with that? Obi?
Yeah, I agree with Anna. Hopefully some minor changes, and if you can take a vote, with the understanding those changes would be made. And then we can release the prospectus as a draft. I would like that.
Okay, so do we have a motion to have Anna and Obi?
Yes, I'd like to move that we approve the draft with some revisions by Anna and Obi so that they can move forward in a timely manner with staff.
Second.
Right. So let's take the vote. Well, Anna,
Yes.
Yes.
Tanya, Lisa,
Yes.
Yes.
Diane, Obi.
Yes.
All right, and I vote yes, and the motion passes. So that's what we're going to do. You'll just adjust a little bit so you feel comfortable, and then we'll release it for public comments. Okay. Great. Okay, so we can move on to agenda item 4. Report of the Delta Stewardship Council Chair and Executive Officer. And I see Julie Lee and Amanda Bohl in the audience, so I'll ask them to move forward. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Sarah, can schedule.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, next item.
Next.
Okay, so I'll hand over the word to you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Inga. Thanks for having us. It's a beautiful day here in the Delta, even though it's going to be a sweltering hot day. The high pressure system sitting above us didn't get the message that we passed the autumnal equinox, did it? Again, we're just pleased to be here in the Delta with you, though. As you may recall, the Delta Council is conducting a 5-year review to evaluate progress implementing the Delta Plan policies, recommendations, and performance measures. The 5-year review process represents a feedback loop in adaptively managing the Delta Plan and informs the Council's next set of near-term priorities. The Council implemented the first 5-year Delta Plan review in 2019 and has been working toward implementing the priority actions recommended in that review. At our last Delta Stewardship Council meeting, the Council staff presented the Delta Plan 5-year review 2024 report summarizing findings and recommendations of a 5-year review of the Delta Plan, which has the following objectives: to evaluate progress implementing the Delta Plan using performance measures, identify where progress towards Delta Plan objectives have been made, and identify where progress is needed to achieve those objectives, as well as focus and prioritize the Council's near-term Delta Plan implementation efforts. Based off of the report and the discussion, the Council adopted the Delta Plan 5-year review at our September meeting. A copy of the report presented to the Council is a part of your meeting package. We'd again like to thank you for submitting comments on that draft review, which were incorporated into the final report. I covered how staff were planning to incorporate Delta ISB feedback at your August meeting, and I just want to highlight them here again today. The ISB suggested adding information describing how the proposed recommendations were selected. In response, the revised report includes more details about this process, including making connections to efforts to other agencies to address the red performing areas that are outside of the Council's sphere of influence. The ISB also offered specific recommendations about implementation of some of the proposed recommendations. And regarding implementation, we wanted to share that accelerating ecosystem restoration is a key Council priority. A DPIC restoration subcommittee has been established and has hosted 2 public restoration forums and is addressing interagency coordinating and permitting issues. as well as developing improved metrics for Delta socioeconomic changes is a proposed priority in the 5-year review. The proposal was modified and refocused on data compilation and synthesis to provide a suite of socioeconomic indicators that can be displayed on the Council's performance measurement dashboard. As the work progresses, staff may reach out to the ISB for feedback on this work, particularly the proposed portfolio of economic metrics. Staff also added additional details, clarifications, and methodology descriptions into the technical appendix of the 5-year review in response to the Delta ISB comments. This includes being clear and transparent regarding data limitations in cases where a simplified metric is used to evaluate a complex attribute of the system, such as wild salmon abundance as a key metric for ecosystem outcomes, or sediment toxicity as a metric for environmental water quality. Finally, the 5-year review process identified opportunities for the performance measures to be improved. The Council anticipates amending the performance measures in the future and will use comments from the ISB in the process. And next, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda Bohl, who's going to provide an overview of the upcoming DPIC meeting.
Anyway, so our next meeting is scheduled for October 28th. We will be focusing on levy. It's actually the first time considering how important levies are to the Delta, and that's actually the main reason that we decided that now is one the Delta levy investment strategy is completed. Council and other Delta. Secondly, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers draft on levies. And then third, we really do believe that the council that levies are the backbone of Delta and can't really thought it was time to highlight that and to kind of share that message more widely. So we will actually be gathering, not too far from here at Bohl, just outside of Clarksburg. We're going to have a meeting outside, which is first for us. And we'll be doing level setting to start the meeting, like a Delta 101 panel. Flood protection board, our staff, we'll be talking about just kind of the Delta. And then we're going to go on a little field trip up to the back side of Bohl, like to the top of the levee, the base that behind, and look at Elkhorn's, talk about the work that they sort of see and others who can do along Elkhorn's according to vegetation for that, including other levees in Delta. And then that afternoon, we're going to have a panel with actually eight people, it's a big panel, but we're going to do kind of lightning round talks. We've asked 8 folks who are all kind of experts in various aspects of levy in Delta to share with us their perspectives on kind of opportunities and challenges around maintenance, climate concern, urban levies, state funding, local funding, levies of habitat, the role that levies play in water supply reliability, and then also vegetation. Tom Holzer will be there to present on the seismic comparison and Jessica Pearson, our executive officer, will be moderating. So we plan to go after we have the lightning presentation, have a robust dialogue around. So around relief would welcome you all. There will not be a virtual option. Unfortunately, we'll be reporting.
A great program. I look forward to that. That's the
I have a question.
Diane. Sorry for ignoring you all the time.
That's okay. I have a question for Amanda. Among this, the participants in this 8-member panel, will there be someone representing agricultural perspective, a farmer? We just went on a very important, valuable tour yesterday, and again, clearly there's state funding, but every farmer invests a whole lot in maintaining the levees and has a lot of responsibility.
Our first presentation that we're going to love Levees 101 will include Tom Zuckerman, who is a local farmer. Maybe you heard from him.
We sure did.
Okay. Tom will be part of that morning presentation, and then also during the levee tour later that morning, Tom Slater, who is also a local farmer, also is with the North Delta Water Agency, and is a very local reclamation district. He will also be speaking to us as well. And then also Wheeler Cosio, who you've probably heard from at various meetings, will also be speaking at 2 different panels. And he's an engineering firm, but his works.
Questions for Julie or Amanda? Not at this time, so we'll go into our 20-minute break. Oh, public comments?
There are no public comments. We're going on a 20-minute break.
Okay, so we're on. All right. Welcome back to the meeting. We are looking forward to another presentation on the draft tribal and environmental justice issue paper by Amanda Bohl and Annie Merritt. And they're already at the presenters table. So I'll just give a brief background what this is about. So the Delta Stewardship Council has released the public review draft of its tribal and environmental justice paper. It's called Tribal and Environmental Justice Issues in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, History and Current Perspectives. The draft presents the Council's understanding of tribal and environmental justice issues in and around the Delta, and recommends actions to better address those issues within the scope of the Council's mission, authority, and influence. Amanda Bohl and Annie Merritt of the Council staff will present the draft to us for discussion. And based on the discussion, we may take action on whether we should submit a comment letter, which would be due on November 4th of this year. So I hand the word to you two.
Hello? Hi. Very loud. You want me to talk more? Can you hear me online? Darn.
Oh, okay.
Oh, great. Okay.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's okay. So anyway, what we hope to do today is to just provide a brief overview of the process that staff undertook to develop the paper, walk you through just the key components, and then outline kind of what's next following the end of the public review period. So next slide, please. Okay. So the council's 2019 5-year review, so this was the first 5-year review that the council conducted, identified environmental justice as a key emerging issue, noting a specific need for more information and analysis to inform future council actions. With all of this in mind, 3 objectives for the issue paper were set, which you can see on our screen, which really focused on building networks, identifying environmental justice issues, and then also identifying options, as I mentioned earlier. The geographic scope of this paper is what is considered the legal Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Staff recognizes that tribes and tribal communities view the legal delta as an artificial construct. So this paper is not a full exploration of all tribal and EJ issues within the watershed, and how tribal and EJ issues manifest both upstream and downstream of the delta, which staff does feel is a topic deserving rigorous study, but really was beyond the scope of this particular paper. Furthermore, when staff began this initiative, we identified the need to delineate between environmental justice as a whole and EJ issues as they relate to tribes and tribal communities, which we refer to as tribal justice in the paper, and we'll talk about it a bit more in a moment. Next slide, please. So to understand tribal and environmental justice, the paper follows the conceptual framework before you here in this graphic. This graphic summarizes the 3 interrelated tenets of representation, process, and distribution used in the paper to build a holistic understanding of environmental justices and injustices in the Delta. And we'll be referencing this framework later in the presentation when we present current issues and recommendations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this has been a 3-year effort and has incorporated several modalities of research, including background research, public comment analysis, interviews, public outreach, and the formation of an EJ expert group. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of those right now, but I'm happy to answer questions later if anyone is curious about more specifics here. Next slide, please. What I do want to talk about, though, is kind of the effort that we went to, or the work that we did to try to identify community-based organizations and to form the EJ expert group. So, because really key to this work, and in particular to the interview component of our research was the formation, was this identification and outreach. And then also the formation of the EJ expert group. And so this process included first staff defining community-based organizations as nonprofit organizations that organize, advocate for, and or provide services to specific populations and communities that are disproportionately impacted by Delta management. Additionally, there are a lot of differing definitions of what it means to be an EJ community. We started with the state's definition of disadvantaged communities that notes disproportionate impacts of pollution and other hazards and demographic factors such as income and unemployment. Our interviews and research have helped us to further define and address the nuances to what determines EJ community, and we have recommendations in our recommendations section related to improving how we can better define these groups. So 2 main components of community input are here on this slide in the dark blue. One has been the creation of the EJ expert group. And again, this is to address as one of our primary objectives to develop closer relationships with community-based organizations. So to do this, we reached out to more than 60 CBOs and more than 100 tribes with diverse expertise and geographical coverage. We held a kickoff call with approximately 20 participants, and then of that, 4 organizations expressed interest and became part of our expert group that we met with for a couple of years throughout this process. And then in terms of the interviews, we conducted more than 20 semi-structured interviews with representatives from community-based organizations to both legitimize and to prioritize voices of communities that have been disenfranchised, marginalized, and disproportionately harmed by environmental burdens. We used the same outreach list for our interviews that we used for the formation of the expert group and applied purposive sampling to get a variety of expertise and geographic focus, and then applied snowball sampling based on interviewee preferences. And I also want to note that Dr. Jessica Rudnick, the council's former Sea Grant social scientist, was the lead, really kind of led this component of the research that we conducted. So as we have been getting closer to approaching the public review draft and then the version that you have in front of you now, our EJ expert group members and several tribes had the opportunity to review what we call the preview draft of the paper prior to its public review release. And we've been spending a concerted effort to connect with and hear from our EJ communities throughout the Delta. And we've attended more than 15 events, reaching more than 200 people. And a lot of those have been just in the last couple of months alone. So anyway, we've been continuing to do outreach throughout the leading up to the public review period and using that information to inform the paper as well. All right, next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit more about kind of our tribal engagement. It has been a very critical component of our work from the beginning. When we kicked off this project, we worked with our tribal liaison at the council to reach out to our tribal listserv for interest in participating in our EJ expert group. And as a result, we have one representative from the California Indian Environmental Alliance who participated in the EJ expert group over the last couple of years. And then we also interviewed 3 tribal serving organizations. And then most importantly, notices were sent for pre-consultation before we began actively writing the paper to all tribes with cultural affiliation to the Delta. And 4 of those tribes requested consultation, and we met with them. But again, as we were just starting to write the paper. And then I'd also, the council in April 2023 held its first ever tribal listening session. And we really tried to listen there in that listening session and incorporate what we heard into the paper as well. We've been doing our best also to attend tribal community events, including Native American Day, Honored Elders Day, and others. And then we are also planning our a 30-day tribal consultation period is going on right now along, what did I say?
90.
Okay. Oh my gosh, that was a bad thing. Yeah. 90-day consultation period with the with tribes. And we are also going to be meeting with tribes over the next couple of months as well directly. And then also hosting a tribal roundtable discussion with tribes on October 15th. Next slide, please. Okay. So for the next several slides, we will be presenting key components of the issue paper, really just providing the primary takeaways. We're not going to go over each section of the paper, as you can see here on this slide in the table of contents, but again, rather kind of touch on the highlights, and then we can delve more into it as there are specific questions. So next slide, please. Okay. So to help us understand the context in which we're attempting to address tribal and environmental justice in the Delta, staff really felt that it was important to include a robust history section. And so kind of key to this has been acknowledging tribal history in the paper. Native people have been part of the Delta ecosystem since time immemorial, and view the whole watershed, the entire watershed, as one interconnected and culturally sacred system. The Delta landscape, however, has been radically transformed from an indigenously managed marshland to industrial ag and freshwater conveyance system by settlers and government, which has set into motion many injustices that shape the region. And these have been complex and interdependent social, ecological, economic, and engineering developments, and have included the Swamplands Act, which incentivized large-scale reclamation for agriculture, also levee building, which enabled conversion to ag to protect from flooding risks. And today there are, over 1,000 miles of levees, which have resulted in a patchwork of islands, channelized waterways, and land subsidence. There's also been redlining, as I think most of you know, the practice, which was led by the Federal Housing Authority in the 1930s and assessed metropolitan areas according to their desirability based on race and other factors. And then lastly, water infrastructure facilitated further displacement of Native Americans. And although tribes have been resilient through the devastation caused by settlers, there has been very long-lasting implications. And so now I am going to hand it over to Annie, who's going to talk about section 5 of the paper, which is current issues. Next slide, please.
Let me just get this close enough here. Hi, ISB members and members of the public. Amanda, I think, just said, but I'm Annie Merritt, an environmental scientist in the council's planning division. I'm going to talk, at a high level about some of the key issues that we discuss in the draft paper. I think Amanda just said this, but in that section 5 called current issues. So the input from all the different sources that informed this paper really led us to identify issues under those 3 tenets of environmental justice that Amanda mentioned earlier: procedural, representational, and distributive justice issues. So just as a few examples, issues related to procedural justice included concerns that government agencies often are just trying to check a box when they do outreach, or people sometimes are unfamiliar with issues or how to engage in government processes, and also inaccessible meeting times and locations often. So a few examples of representational injustices. For example, this included just the need for us to better understand which communities are most impacted by environmental harms in the Delta and throughout the state who are affected by Delta management, and just figuring out how to really create a place at the table for tribes and environmental justice communities to truly be able to participate in Delta governance. So those issues are discussed in more depth in the paper, but we are going to cover some of the other issues. So for distributive justice, we identify and talk about 7 kind of key overarching issue areas. So these include water, flooding, climate change, pollution and public health, housing and homelessness, food security and access, and recreation and outdoor access. And we'll be going over those just a few moments. But first, I'm going to present a summary of the tribal justice issues. I just want to note that all of these issues are deeply interrelated. So because tribes and tribal communities have their own unique experiences, we talk about all 3 tenets of environmental justice as they relate to tribes in their own section in the paper. So for a little context first, today there are over 100 federally recognized tribes in the state, as well as numerous non-federally recognized tribes. And many Native American people, some of whom are not, tribal members, who live both within and outside the current legal Delta, who have ancestral ties to the Delta and the Delta watershed. So many tribes consult with local, state, and federal government processes, really just to help advance their own priorities and seek recognition and redress for the many environmental injustices enacted against them over time. So as we define in the paper, tribal justice is really the advancement of equity for tribal nations and Native communities, with the understanding that tribal sovereign rights, traditions, and cultures have been and are still being affected by environmental hazards and other impacts. So, on to a quick summary of some of the key tribal justice issues. So for recognitional and representational injustices, examples of these are often the lack of recognition of tribal priorities by government agencies and developers. And also another example is just often the non-recognition of traditional knowledge as being science. For procedural justice issues, some examples of this include often the disregard or disrespect of tribal representatives and the marginalization of their expertise, as well as the exclusion of specific groups from agency engagement processes, including non-federally recognized tribes. And then for distributive justice issues, there are a few of those issues that face tribes and tribal communities uniquely. So just as an example, Indigenous communities might have unique exposure to water contamination if they use water for ceremonies or eat fish that are harvested from contaminated waters. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, now I'm going to spend some time talking about those 7 key distributive justice issue areas. So first, water. So water justice, we heard a lot about water, which you might expect. So just some examples of that include concerns about the just water supply and management system overall, including concerns about injustices with the water rights system, the conveyance of Delta water, concerns about water quality, and just as one example, the recent proliferation of harmful algal blooms and water affordability. So on the slide here, this is just one example of some of the drinking water issues that we see in the Delta today. So as of April 2024, 11 small drinking water systems were failing human right to water standards, and 27 of those systems are at risk of failing those standards. Okay, and so for flood risk, just a few examples. There were concerns about the allocation of levee investments, flood insurance access and affordability, and land use planning. And then for climate change, lots of issues, but one example is just, certain communities are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change related hazards. So for example, in our Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment, and as we note in the paper, Stockton and much of the rest of San Joaquin County, we found are the most vulnerable to increasing flood risks in the future with climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, so pollution exposure, public health, and recreation and outdoor access. Just very quickly, Amanda defined redlining earlier. So studies have demonstrated that historically redlined areas, including in the Delta, today are correlated with greater vulnerability to a variety of environmental hazards, such as pollution or extreme heat compared to non-redlined areas. And then, really quickly for recreation, outdoor and green space access. Across the Delta, there's currently unequal access to recreational areas and green space. And really that's had resulting impacts to people's well-being. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last kind of overarching issue area. So this is another set of really important and deeply related issues. So first, just the rising cost of living and cost of housing in this region. As one example, the Delta Residence Survey showed us that about 1/4 of Delta residents had a household income of $50,000 annually or lower, and really said that being able to afford to meet their basic needs is a key challenge to their well-being. On a somewhat related note, we've been seeing a rising number of unhoused populations across the region and in California generally, and really a lack of adequate sanitation resources for those communities. And it's a big issue. It's really a violation of human rights and human dignity. And then for food security and access, just as one example, 4 of the Delta's counties have a higher rate of food insecurity than the state average. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to talk about the recommendations in the draft paper at kind of a high level. So you just heard me talk about a pretty diverse set of issues that came up in this process. And, some of those issues are beyond the council's authority maybe to address directly. But we really wanted to point out that part of our role as an agency and in writing this paper is to really document and share all of those issues that we heard about that communities are dealing with, because we want all organizations who work in the Delta to see what we heard. So the recommendations in the paper include a set of more general recommendations for all who work in the Delta, including the council. And then we have a more specific list of recommendations that are for the council specifically. And we'll touch on that, on examples of those in a moment. But next slide, please. Okay, so, never mind, not next slide, sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna go over this list of the general recommendations. So this is This is a summary of them, but these include things like the importance of investing in relationship and trust building, really recognizing that often government agencies, including ours, need to work to build trust or maybe rebuild trust. The importance of working through trusted community partners. I think, the council's really been trying to do this in recent years more, but, it makes sense. People trust the organizations that they already know and work with in their local communities. And, it's important to work with those communities in our work, those organizations. So another one is to really be intentional and justice oriented, and recognizing that often many of these communities have been left out of planning and policy conversations for generations. And again, building or rebuilding trust may take a while. Okay. Moving on, just the importance of making it easy to participate in government processes, following through to really be transparent about how people's feedback will be used, and then actually following up to say how it was incorporated. And then just moving on to the final one, to identify and fill tribal and environmental justice research needs and effectively communicate findings. So we, in the interviews that I think, Amanda mentioned earlier, we asked the people that we interviewed how research or other data collection could really serve the communities that they work with. And these are presented in the paper in more detail. But for example, we heard about a couple data needs on topics of emerging concern, such as harmful algal blooms, for example, and just more information on how they impact human health. And then what also came up is really the need to better communicate and share research findings in a way that's accessible to communities. And then really an overall theme of what we heard is just the need to also involve tribes and communities to really be able to identify their own research needs and help design science activities to address those needs and make sure that they're being addressed in an appropriate way. And we have some detailed recommendations on that for the council that Amanda will be going over later. But first, next slide, I'm going to start going over the council specific recommendations. So goal 1 is really working to integrate environmental justice into the Delta Stewardship Council over both the short and long term. So some example actions under this goal include memorializing the council's commitments to environmental justice through a resolution to be adopted by the council. We also have a number of actions to create a more inclusive workplace at the council. And then we also have an action really recommending that we improve our understanding of California EJ communities in the Delta and also outside of the Delta who are affected by Delta management. So improving our understanding of where those communities are located spatially. Quickly as one example, I think many of the ISB members and others in this room maybe have heard us talk about the council's social vulnerability index that we created as part of Delta Adapts in our vulnerability assessment. So this really was a good start to identifying the communities most vulnerable to climate change, but it really has a lot of limitations, and we could really build from this in the future to better identify EJ communities. And then finally, just this goal also has some various actions on how to improve tribal and environmental justice community representation in Delta governance, including developing new partnership models between agencies, tribes, and community organizations. Next slide, please. Okay, so goal 2. This goal focuses specifically on tribes. So here are a couple example actions. We recommend that the council engage in partner agency efforts around tribal access and use of the Delta, such as land return and co-management, continuing to provide cultural humility trainings to council members and staff, continuing to explore how to interweave traditional knowledge into the Delta science enterprise, and continuing to improve our tribal consultation practices, including making sure to continue engaging early and often and regularly evaluating the council's tribal consultation policy. And now I'll pass it over to Amanda to talk about the last 2 goals.
Great. Thanks, Annie. So goal 3 really is about furthering community engaged research and partnerships and helping communities with their research needs or meet their research needs. And so examples of how we will support this is supporting community engaged research that centers on community needs and desires. This includes tribes and EJ practitioners in the Council's Delta Science Community of Social Science Community of Practice, and into our Science for Communities program, which pairs community organizations with scientists to collaborate on projects together. This also includes safeguarding tribal data ownership, and we propose developing a council data management protocol for any data shared by tribes and communities to make sure that this information is handled responsibly. Another important component of this goal is to improve the communication and distribution of science in the Delta through good communication practices and transparency, such as making council-sponsored research and data publicly available when it isn't held in trust from a tribal or a community partner. And then also using the council's communication resources to share information about climate change risks directly to Delta communities. Next slide. So, and then finally, our final goal is focused on addressing funding inequities in the Delta and in our own science funding process. We will support, or we propose supporting equitable investments in Delta communities through guiding funding to tribes and EJ communities where possible, such as through exploring a climate justice technical assistance program to help Delta communities prepare for and adapt to climate change, supporting Delta-specific legislative appropriations that are targeted toward EJ and tribal communities. And then to make the council science funding process more equitable, we propose developing a proposal evaluation criteria for EJ communities that helps applicants and reviewers consider how EJ issues should be integrated into research. And then finally, evaluating opportunities to dedicate Delta science funding for tribal and environmental justice research. Next slide. So next steps, as we've mentioned, the draft paper is currently out for a 60-day public review period, which will end November 4th, and also for a 90-day tribal consultation period, which will end in early December. On October 15th, we'll be hosting an in-person and virtual tribal roundtable. And then during the public comment period, staff is conducting additional community outreach. This fall, we plan to join events in Stockton, Sacramento, Walnut Grove, Lodi, and West Sacramento to continue to connect with Delta community members. And then we really do intend to, the concerns that we hear at these community events, we will consider along with other public comments as we finalize the paper. We've also, just in terms of outreach, we have translated the executive summary and the info sheets into Spanish, and those are available on our website. And then our plan is to bring a final back to the council early next year for endorsement, and potentially a resolution that Annie mentioned. That's we're here to answer any questions you have, happy to answer, if there's any specific areas you'd like us to jump into a little bit more, Annie and I can answer those questions and give you more information. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda and Annie, for giving us the summary. Before we start the discussion or the question and answer session here, I would like the ISB members to know that Tanya has offered to take a close, Tanya, with the help of Lisa, has offered to take a close look at the document and give us her evaluation of whether we should submit a comment letter or not. We don't have to do it. We haven't been asked to provide comments, so it's up to us. And so we don't have to make that decision today. Did I understand that right? Yeah.
Yeah, or we could. Or we couldn't.
Or we could, yes.
We might discuss it right now.
If we really don't want to, we can decide that too. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, let's just go to question and answers. Bob.
Okay. Well, Amanda and Anna, I thought that was a great presentation, and I read the document and I really liked it a lot. It hit on so many of the important issues, and it was done in well, in such a pleasing way, in a sense of, of being able to read it and understand it. And it's possibly that I agreed with so many things that were in the document and so forth. I do, however, have a couple of thoughts about it that hopefully these could be improvements. Is one thing, and this comes from my experience in the Columbia River Basin, where we have dealt with issues like this as part of our independent science board for decades, and we have 26, 28 different recognized tribes within that basin. And I remember early on that we recognized that there was a lot of injustices in terms of the research and understanding and so forth. And one of the things that we needed to do in the Columbia Basin was really help the disadvantaged communities, not just the tribes, but the disadvantaged communities, to help them build their infrastructure so that they could not only receive funds as well as information, but they could put them to good use. And that it took a long time. It's not finished. It was very expensive in terms of how funds were reallocated. And you probably know this from your work and so on, that, these days in the Columbia Basin, we have what are called the accords, where we've gotten to a stage where the infrastructure within the tribes now is sufficient, where they have their own fisheries units, they have their own environmental units, they have their own cultural units and so forth. But that took a lot of years to bring that around, and also, really supporting the tribes towards sending people for education, higher level education at colleges and universities, so that they came back and really helped, within their communities and could contribute in very positive ways going forward. And it feels like these days that we finally have got traction on that. But it requires a continuous and very expensive commitment towards supporting that infrastructure. And I don't know if it'll ever stand on its own 2 feet, but it really requires the bigger society, or the larger society, being able to do that. So anyway, in your report, it would be nice if the idea of the importance of infrastructure within the communities and what it's going to take, that could be brought to the forefront, so that we really have an understanding of the full issue and what it's going to take, to try and overcome that, or not overcome it, but, support it in a way that's where it's going to be viable on its own. And then my other comment is probably a minor one, and it perhaps comes from my very quick reading of the document, is that I thought there was a bit of I don't know what it is. Well, it was like the tribes were equated with environmental injustice, but environmental injustice does not equate with tribes. It's more than tribes. For example, the tribes may have that, and I'm not as familiar with the integrity of the tribes or their makeup in this area. But I also recognize that there's other communities within the Delta that are kind of the recipients of environmental injustice and so forth. You've got Asian communities here, that were literally, transported here in the 1800s and so on. You've got Spanish and Mexican communities. You've got people displaced by the American Depression and so forth, coming here. I mean, there's all sorts of communities here. And yet in the document, it seemed like when we talked about environmental injustices, it was only tribes, and yet there was a lot more to it than that. And I'm not sure how you reach those other groups. I don't know what their structure is, and how you would communicate with that. But and maybe you don't want to be that comprehensive in this report. Maybe it is just focused on tribes, or should be just focused on tribes so you can get your hands around it. But anyway, that was just an impression I got from a quick reading of it. So anyway, great report, and I really enjoyed reading it. It was really well done. So thank you. Yeah.
Thing to that, or
I think No, we generally are trying to talk about tribes and all the other communities as well. So that's why I appreciate that feedback that maybe it appears that we're not. I mean, we do want to talk about tribes because of just the foundational, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but the tribal communities have been here for so long, and so we do want to give them that respect and that honor that needs to be there as well. But I also don't want the reader to read it and feel like we're not also addressing the other communities that have also been marginalized over the last several hundred years as well. So I appreciate that feedback. Yeah.
Unlike Bob, I did not have an opportunity to read the report. I really appreciate your broad overview, and I'm looking forward to reading the report. I wanted to comment on some of the science education issues and science research coordination from the point of view of my experience working at the National Science Foundation in the Arctic program, where there's been a great deal of science outreach and this idea of co-production of knowledge as really pervasive, and issues of ownership or guarding data. It was very important in that, in the context of fisheries, for example, the hesitancy to release information publicly about hunting resources in fear that tourists would come with their helicopters and shoot down the, anyway, there were a lot of issues. So I just want to point out that there's some commonality that in these other regions, as Bob mentioned, the Columbia, but a lot of action in terms of the Arctic, in terms of identifying research questions and integrating both anthropological approaches, interviewing elders, people who are still alive and remember the 1950s, and those other social science approaches, that there's windows of opportunity for this that won't be here in 20 years. And then the other aspect of the science communication, you can take a direct approach, or another approach is through the language preservation and documentation, and then that can be an avenue for connecting in terms of science communication. So beyond Spanish, there are again these languages that are part of the culture, and language is culture, and can be then a way to engage on scientific questions, and even preserving some of the narratives, cultural narratives, both in English and in the native language. If any of them are written down, I don't know, can help be a way to connect, rather than having a direct effort. I want to tell you this fact about CO2, but more from an indirect way can be effective. Just saying.
Tanya.
Yeah. So thanks, Amanda and Annie, for the presentation. And also, I really want to just compliment you on, I know this has been 3 years of really hard work, and it's really important work. So I just want to emphasize that. And I had a chance to start reading it in detail, but I haven't gotten through all of it in detail. And I think, as Bob mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of really important and rich information in there. And my just initial takeaway is that I think it would be worthwhile for us as a board to provide some feedback in a more formalized way. It doesn't have to be, one of our typical ISB 40, 50-page reviews. It could be something more concise, perhaps. But largely because of the importance of this document, and because we have folks on the board with some expertise on this topic. Environmental justice has a lot of social science literature and research behind it that I'm familiar with and Lisa's familiar with. Bob and Diane have, knowledge of practical applications on the co-management side and all this. So I do think that there's some value that we could bring there. And also the methods that were used to develop the report and the recommendations, the social science methods there, I do think Lisa and I can bring some unique perspective to maybe just help communicate some of those findings in a way that emphasizes the validity of those methods and brings some weight to the report that could be helpful as you get it out to the rest of the world. Again, so I do think this is just really important. I don't really have questions for you right now. I have some, comments I've started writing down and ideas, and I just want to say thank you for all this effort and work, and I really do hope that my fellow board members will be willing to provide some directed feedback that hopefully will be useful to y'all. That's it.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, very nice presentation. I do have a very simple clarifying question. It's a nice, there's a lot of detail on, but I'm very interested in the vulnerability assessment, particularly related to water issues. So I was wondering if there is any background information on the methods and the analysis that may have been used. And I agree with Tanya, it'll be good for us to provide some kind of feedback on the report and the methods. But for me, particularly on the vulnerability assessment, the climate change, and I feel like that's related to what we might be planning for this climate symposium, understanding the spatial variability of climatic impact in the future. So that's all I wanted to, and I would support providing any comments, as a board.
Yeah, thank you. I think this will answer your question that the climate change vulnerability assessment that I referred to, which includes looking at climate change impacts to water supply and water quality, that's the Delta Adapts Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment that the council released, I think it was in 2021. And so, yeah, that vulnerability assessment and the whole Delta Adapts effort, just want to say that's really informed this issue paper and vice versa. So we've really been kind of incorporating from both efforts into the other. So yeah, that vulnerability assessment is available online on the council's climate change webpage, and we can also provide a link to that. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
That sounds good. I will look it up. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Too close.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. Very clear, very helpful. I have a few comments. I appreciate how ambitious you were in trying to incorporate that history and get all the way to recommendations. That it's really to be commended. I also, you don't tout this in the report, and I don't in any way want to speak for these communities, but I was encouraged to see that you are already making progress on some of these goals. We saw the Delta Stewardship Council was a key member in affecting some joint research between NOAA and the tribes, and I just want to acknowledge that you're starting to walk the walk, and it's nice to see. I do have one question about how you're doing the tribal engagement at this point, just because that may inform our comments. And I do agree with Tanya that we have some comments that we'd like to offer. What is the nature of those engagements? Are you getting good engagement from the tribes? Because there are some points in here where it narrows down quite a bit to the total tribes versus the engaged tribes. How is that going?
Yeah, so as as I mentioned, so our EJ expert group included 4 nonprofits. One of them was a tribal representing organization called the California Indian Environmental Alliance. And so that's been our most direct connection to date. But we met, I think, as I mentioned, prior to the drafting of the paper. Like we did a lot of the research and we were just trying to kind of put everything together. We did send out a notice for pre-consultation with tribes and did meet directly with 4 tribes and just listen to them around kind of what they wanted to see in terms of a tribal and environmental justice issue paper to, find out what was important to them that we include and take into consideration. And so that definitely has informed the content of the paper and the organization of the paper as well. And then we just, with the public review, with the release of the public review draft, we also sent out through our tribal liaison request for or notification of a consultation period for this paper as well. And we've received feedback, I think, from several tribes at this point that they intend to submit comments and that they also want to participate in our tribal listening session on October 15th, which will focus on the paper. And for that, we plan to do just even an abbreviated probably presentation than we did just now, really so that we can spend as much time as possible hearing from and listening to the tribes who participate. And so that has been we've been trying to do more than what is required as a state agency. And we are hopeful that we get even more feedback and more tribes engaged and interested in meeting with us over the next couple of months.
I have related to this, and Annie, maybe you're covering this, but when you do that listening and you have the conversations recorded, or are you going to do any sort of systematic analysis of what was said and to try to incorporate that in? Like what do you do with the listening?
Yeah, no, that is absolutely, I mean, that's what we're trying to do with every public comment or every outreach opportunity or every outreach that we do is to then kind of, collate all of our notes, start looking to where we can see, several, when things have been mentioned multiple times. And yes, we are developing in a very systematic way. I think we've got a big spreadsheet that we're working on right now. And so, yes, we are looking to do that in a way that we really are trying to capture everything and make sure that we're capturing everything that was heard. Yeah. Anything you want to add? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add, I think Amanda said this earlier, but it was kind of a long presentation. We also really took what we heard at that council tribal listening session that was held in April 2023. And oh yeah, the other thing I was going to mention, I think it was 3 or 4 tribal serving organizations that we interviewed, as part of those 22 interviews. So, so I guess we're definitely trying to talk directly with tribes, but also organizations that serve tribes. And just really taking what we heard from all of those events and putting it into the paper. So.
I'm not a social scientist, but I did really enjoy reading the report. It's very well written, and I learned a lot. So what I hear from the board, though, is that we do want to submit a comment letter. And if you don't agree, speak up now. And Tanya and Lisa will take the lead on that. All right. So, and then we can discuss it at the next November meeting, at the next meeting of the board. Right. Edmund.
Just have a few things if you're ready to think about them, or you can wait until our next meeting. If you want any feedback from the board based on what they read in written form, or do you just want to produce like a draft for discussion at the next meeting? Or kind of like, or maybe not the next meeting.
Yeah, written feedback that based on their reading of it that they want to send to Edmund to then send to us to help incorporate into that initial draft. And then we can discuss the draft. Would that work?
Yeah. To get in written comments, or do folks need more time?
Do we need to say Anybody?
Isn't there a November 4th deadline for feedback? So we have to work with that timeline. No? Okay,
But feel free to chime in, Amanda.
We'll work with you. Yeah.
Weeks, have your comments sent to Edmund within the next 2 weeks. And then we'll go from there. Thank you for being flexible. Okay, do we have any public comments on this topic?
There are none.
We will now move on to agenda item 6, and this is just to take a little bit of time to reflect on our field tour to Rindge, Tract in Staten Island yesterday. And I just want to, ahead of everything, I want to thank all the organizers and the people of the Delta Stewardship Council who made it go so smoothly, to herd everybody to the field in the 103-degree heat, and it just worked without a glitch. So thank you guys. I also want to thank the people who gave us presentations, among them Tom Zuckerman and Jeff Klein and Jared Dixon and Alan Bacon, who took us on a tour of Staten Island. It was really, really informative and super interesting. So for those who did not join us, so I'll give a brief summary. We met with Tom Zuckerman and Jeff Klein, whose families co-own and manage part of Rindge Tract. They provided an overview of how crops more typical of the Delta lowlands are farmed and how traditional methods of irrigation and drainage are employed. In addition, we received an overview of an upcoming project by Pelican Renewables LLC, which will construct a deep injection well and related infrastructure on Rindge Tract for geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide. At Staten Island, we met Jared Dixon, president of Conservation Farms and Ranches, and Alan Bacon, a biologist who manages the Staten Island Conservation Program. They led a tour of the island, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy. They provided an overview of land management practices that implement wildlife-friendly agriculture with a focus on supporting key migratory bird species. And we got to see sandhill cranes, yay. Additionally, they discussed habitat management goals related to climate change, subsidence, greenhouse gas reduction, and carbon sequestration. So again, thanks everybody who was involved, and of course the speakers yesterday for giving us the opportunity of learning a lot about the Delta. So now I would like to hear from the beneficiaries of yesterday's tour and to give us your impressions, please. Bob?
First, I thought yesterday was one of the very best days we've had in the field, and it was primarily because the places we visited, well, not the places so much, but the people that we encountered for those visits gave us a very positive and articulate view of what could be the future of the Delta. They really were people who were thinking about the future and how it might be implemented in ways that I guess personally I had never really considered before. And anyway, I came away feeling very hopeful at the end of the day, and just really greatly enjoyed interacting with the folks that we did interact with. So just a great field trip, really useful.
I agree with Bob. It was inspiring to hear the comments and future optimistic future perspectives of the people we met, and it was thrilling to see all the birds at the end of the day, even though we were so tired after all the heat for a bit, but a great field trip, and thanks to the staff who organized it. And I think especially for the report on subsidence issues, this was a particularly valuable field trip.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, Diane, that the subsidence workshop that we held last year, right around this time, when we had a panel of farmers that shared with us some of the practices that are happening in the Delta to re-wet the soil and help mitigate some of the subsidence issues, particularly rice growing. And one of the things we learned yesterday was that those rice growing practices are really taking off in the Delta and expanding a lot more than what we were even learning about last year at this time. So it's really interesting just to see the change and the dynamics that's happening, and to learn about how that's happening in the Delta. And I agree with Bob and Diane too. It was just such a terrific day and really great hosts. So yeah.
Thing to see the birds at the waterfowl, if you will. We also got to see rice, you know, and see how the rice grains are developed, and learn specifically about rice.
Thanks. Yeah, I too really enjoyed the field trip. And what I want to emphasize is just how it really showed the power of science. So we talked to these visionaries essentially who had a vision of how the Delta could change and slow or reverse subsidence. But it was ultimately the science that was very convincing, right? So they're demonstrating that one can be profitable as a rice farmer despite substantial upfront costs. They were also building in, helping to support the policy tools that would enable farmers to get support for these transition costs. And they're really testing whether they're getting the performance they want. And so it was just nice to see, because you often don't see the visionaries spending the time to invest in the science too. And so that was a very powerful message.
One last thing on that too. I think it was really important to hear about the water management practices for rice growing in the Delta, to understand how the demands for water are different in the Delta from other parts of the valley, of the Sacramento Valley, and the sub-irrigation practices that were just really cool to learn about. So
totally agree. Yeah. I thought I learned a lot, and they were prepared to answer all the difficult questions too. I mean, how much water does this crop use, and how does that work, and what makes sense, and the pesticide question and all that. So I think they are really aware of what the issues are, and that made me feel really good about that too. So I'm with Bob. Made me feel hopeful for a bright future, brighter. Okay.
I have one other comment is we have been aware of how the maintenance of the levees and those costs are borne to a large extent by the agricultural economy. And we really got to see that in action and hear about their investments, the farmers' investments and attention on a daily basis to maintaining the levees, and understanding how this whole water infrastructure is dependent on this, or influenced by the profitability of the agricultural economy in terms of providing water to Southern California. And it could be that people in Southern California don't really understand that.
Well, overall, I think that was a huge success. Just the weather gods. You have to, connect with them some more. All right. Are there any public comments?
There are none. Oh, no, we're good. There are none.
7, and we're getting close to lunch, I promise. The subsidence review, which of course is, we learned a lot about that yesterday. Tom Holzer isn't with us today, but Tanya has offered to give a brief
It will be
synopsis.
very brief, yes.
Yeah.
I've been working on integrating some of the feedback we received at the previous ISB meeting, and it's now in the just polishing phases, and staff has that in their hands to help us make sure we don't have any periods missing or T's that aren't crossed or something. So yes, that's where we are, and we should have a draft ready to send out for review. Public comment soon. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Margot, sitting next to Tanya, our fellow supporting the ISB this year, is going to be working with Dylan Chappell, who you heard from earlier. And I think you're meeting with Jared Dixon. So, because one of the items we're trying to get hot off the press into your document is a map that shows where all these rice growing areas are, as well as all of the subsidence reversal areas. And it's changing so rapidly, as Tanya mentioned, that we're having to get updated information directly from Jared, who seems to be in the loop on all the rice farming in the Delta.
Report will be just clarifying, as of the date we wrote this report, this was what we knew and what we had drawn from our workshop, of course, from last year. But that has been the tricky part of this review, is that we tried to really use the workshop as our primary source of information to guide this report. But as this is the dynamic kind of context, we also want to be somewhat up to date. So we're trying to walk that line a little bit, but at some point you have to cut the cord. So.
It's incredible how fast things are moving in the Delta. That's actually really great. So are there any public comments in this item?
There are none.
Yay. So we are going to have a lunch break. And we will reconvene at 1 p.m. All right. Okay, start. All right, thank you. I'd like to reconvene the meeting. Oh, nobody here anymore. We had our lunch break and a quick tour through the Ride Hotel. Thank you for that. So the next agenda item is number 8, a discussion of the food webs review, but more importantly, a report on where we are and also on your experience at the Delta Science Conference. So hang on. I would like to provide some background first before I hand over to Bob. So at the last public meeting, we finalized the food webs review. Dr. Nyman worked with staff to format the report. The goal of this review is to assess how to better incorporate and advance food web knowledge in managing the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta's ecosystems, and to identify what tools are available or should be developed. The final report was presented at the Bay Delta Science Conference. I will now turn over to Bob to report on the conference and other outreach plans now that the report has been finalized.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Werner. As Inga said, we presented the report at the Bay Delta or the Bay Delta conference a couple of days ago. With the absolute essential help of Edmund and the rest of the staff, the report was actually released around 7 a.m. on the morning of the presentation. And so that the QR code that we showed at the conference was actually live and people could download the report. I think with the exception of probably a few just little minor typos and so on, if we find any. The report will be printed in about 2 weeks, so somewhere around the 15th or so, and be available. In terms of the presentation itself, it seemed to go very well, but there were no questions afterwards, and it was primarily because I went over time. The buttons on the console showed that I had plenty of time until the moderator stood up and said I had no time, so no questions. But there were about, I'm estimating now, there were about let's say 150 people in the audience, and if you could judge from the facial expressions of those, at least the ones I could see, they were all paying attention and they were nodding their heads up and down and, and showing, general support for the recommendations, within the report. The report itself, we are, we know that the Interagency Ecological Program is going to have an activity on food webs going forward, or at least they're floating a proposal in that regard. Dr. Rosemary Hartman is leading this effort. In speaking to people that are involved in that, in the initial efforts at the conference, it seems like it is going to go forward, and I think we should all be very pleased, to see that happening. In the coming weeks, I and others will be working with Edmund and the staff to find other outlets for disseminating information and recommendations out of the report. And, the obvious candidates are, Maven's Notebook, the listserv, the DISB listserv, and so forth. So, but if any of you are aware of other outlets where we should contact them, let Edmund and I know, and we'll follow up on it. So anyway, everything is going quite well so far, and the report you should have a hard copy in hand, and if you want an electronic copy, the QR code is available. Right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bob. I just would like to add that the next steps, right? So it will be released. It will also be released to Maven's Notebook, Delta e-News, mailing list, along with the workshop attendees, kind of thing. So, and then there will be a presentation to council in November. Yeah, and if there are any other ideas.
No, that's right. In November, I think it's November 21st, I'll be presenting a summary of the food web activities in the report to the council.
Yeah. So thanks a lot and congratulations.
All right. Thank you.
I thought you did really well, and I listened to your talk, and it was a really nice summary of the report.
Great. All right. Thank you. It's appreciated.
So are there any questions from ISB members? No. Are there any public comments?
There are none.
Right, so we'll move on to the other review, decision-making under deep uncertainty. To give some background, the review builds an understanding of the scientific tools and concepts that can increase the capacity to anticipate and adapt to growing uncertainty of future conditions in the Bay Delta system. I always think there should be 2 sentences here, but it has 2 main components: a seminar series and an inventory and analysis of scenario planning in the region. There was a panel discussion on the topic moderated by Tanya Heikkila and Lisa Wanger, and a presentation in a special session at the Bay Delta Science Conference on post-normal decision-making by Obi. So just Obi cannot be here anymore. I think he's on the plane now, but Edmund will share his thoughts on his behalf.
Yes. So Dr. Obasekara sent me some of his thoughts about his presentation and his session, and I'll be sharing what he provided to me. So the special session that Inga mentioned was on post-normal decision-making. It was organized by Alejo Cross-Polk and also Brett Milligan from UC Davis. They have also invited the ISB to join in with them on a special issue about post-normal decision-making in the region for the San Francisco Watershed and Estuary Sciences Journal. So that was the context of getting this special invitation to be part of this session. There were other talks in the session on structured decision-making and also on co-design. So essentially, Obe provided an overview of DMDU, its benefits and limitations from his perspective, and also covering what we learned from the seminar series. Also that day, in addition to the food web review, the Delta ISB's synthesis report on the decision-making under deep uncertainty seminar series that was led by Kyra Wallace, support staff for the board, was released that day as a QR code, and it was officially soft launched. We'll be doing more formal promotion after this week. In terms of Obe's thoughts, he mentioned during his session, there was a lot of discussion about structured decision-making. And then one of the Q&A questions was actually noticing the similarities between robust decision-making, which is a tool that was covered during the DMDU seminar series, and structured decision-making. So Obe just noted that maybe in future work, as this work progresses, acknowledging like some of the structured decision-making work and linking it to robust decision-making. I wish Obe was here because I cannot properly describe the differences between robust decision-making and structured decision-making. So in Obe's presentation, he presented what he called the spectrum of uncertainties. And based off his view of the other sessions and other talks in the post-normal decision-making session, he noted that he did not see much traction or attention in deeply uncertain scenarios, such as wildcards. One of his ideas that came out of the conference was that he should classify like what the ISB reviewed according to a level of uncertainty, and then the actual method that is being used. So that's just one of the ideas that came out of his reflections from his session. And this will demonstrate like the lack of attention to like black swan events. So just like an idea of how to characterize information. The other thing that he saw was outside the session that he wanted to share was Andrew Shorts from the Department of Water Resources also presented in the modeling section on the modeling session in terms of the State Water Project Delivery Capability Report. And then Obe noted that he's still concerned about the use of historical traces, even after adjustments for scenario development. He saw that many were touting that the work that was presented, but he thinks there should be greater discussion with the Department of Water Resources on that issue, which will help inform the climate symposium. And then prior to this presentation, we were also planning to have a representative from DWR talk about the new State Water Project Delivery Capability Report. So those were some of the reflections from Obe.
Thanks a lot, Edmund, for that. We now come to the panel discussion on the decision-making under deep uncertainty. And I'm going to ask Lisa and Tanya to let us know how that went. Lisa?
Thank you. And I also just want to say Obe did a great job describing DMDU tools at the conference, and I appreciated his clarity since he is often engaged in applying these tools in the Everglades. But Tanya and I were lucky enough to lead a panel discussion that was on the last day of the conference. But we still had a good turnout, so that was a good sign. It was the last session on the last day and still substantial audience participation. The panel was convened so that we had an opportunity to learn about how various organizations address uncertainties. These were all Delta relevant agencies, what tools they use, and get some of their reactions to the discussion of DMDU tools. Did they think they were feasible and useful? Our panelists were Jeff Henderson of the Delta Stewardship Council, who leads the Delta Adapts, Felicia Marcus from Stanford University, Lindsay Correa from California Department of Water Resources, and Kathleen Schaefer from UC Davis. So I want to just point out that both of the academics, Felicia and Kathleen, were what Felicia called pracademics, so that they had done a lot of practice, but had now entered into academia to teach what they've learned from being practical. And also Kathleen was working on a PhD specifically looking at insurance instruments as a way to mitigate climate risk. The session was recorded, and we're going to use that recording to do a nice thorough write-up and Maven's Notebook will do a lot of that write-up. And I'll just want to, before I turn it over to Tanya, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the panel and their practical perspective on how the tools can be used. And I was particularly surprised that they were really rather supportive, because we'd heard some initial concerns, some initial pushback, but instead, especially when I had some one-on-one conversations at the end, folks talked about really wanting to find change agents and seeing the need for incorporating more extreme scenarios and thinking through how systems were changing. And so that was just very nice to see. And now I'll let Tanya give her reflections.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think Lisa did a nice job summarizing kind of some of my main takeaways. I do think the panelists also, just in their comments and in the Q&A, it reminded me how important it is to think about DMDU and kind of the broader ecosystem of decision support tools and decision-making approaches that agencies and different organizations with relevance in the Delta to the work that they're doing. And yeah, I think there was a acknowledgement that the DMDU tools are good tools and useful, but they also, the way they shared their kind of thoughts on them reflected on some of these broader issues in organizations of, you don't just throw a tool in there and expect it to happen. Kind of going back to Lisa's point about you might need to have the right cultural and kind of institutional support to really get it off the ground. And so that seemed to be one of the bigger challenges than even just like resources or capacity from the perspective of this panel. But we'll do a little more to dive into the comments, since I was trying to pay attention and ask right questions. I probably haven't processed all the comments as closely as I should, but we'll bring that into our report and keep working on the synthesis of what we've learned from the various components of this DMDU exercise. So yeah, anything to add?
You did a great job moderating the panel,
Okay,
first of all.
thanks.
I just want to acknowledge what a great moderator Tanya is. And yeah, I completely agree that we haven't had a lot of time to process. And I think we learned some important things that are hard to get across quickly about maybe fitting the tools to different institutional cultures initially, but then maybe working on more long-term change. And so we'll be thinking about that.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions about this in the panel? No? Are there any public comments?
There are none.
We'll move to agenda item 10, but it basically is a continuation of talking about the Bay Delta Science Conference. So we had several other activities. So Margot presented a poster and on the monitoring enterprise review, which I missed, unfortunately, but I hope to get to look at it anyway. So I would like to turn it over to you, Margot, to let us know a little bit about that.
Yeah, this was the poster titled The Delta Monitoring Enterprise, a comprehensive review by the Delta Independent Science Board. So this was a poster that has been presented at other conferences before, but we got a lot of good engagement with the poster this time around. People commenting that it was a really important topic. One person who was involved in monitoring in the Delta commented that a lot of the recommendations that were outlined in the report and also on the poster are similar to goals that they have in their own monitoring programs, and mentioned that it could be good to kind of gather people that are working around this space or this topic of monitoring in the Delta to share ideas, kind of like have conversations and talk about ways that you can actually have like implementation of these recommendations. And another person mentioned that they were also really interested and they like these kind of broader recommendations, but were interested in how to scale them down to the size of their water district. And we're curious if there was any opportunities for like workshops or kind of like mentorship by part of the ISB on how they could actually implement this to their smaller scale monitoring programs. So yeah, those were two big takeaways or comments.
Yeah. Oh, we always want to scale up, right? Or not? I do. Okay, so there was also, thank you, Margot. There was also, Tanya was part of a panel on improving collaborative engagements. And I'd like to turn over to you and hear how that went.
Yeah, this was such a great panel. I had several kind of big takeaways from this panel. One is that there's been an evolution of collaboration in the California Delta over the last 30 years. And I think it can be easy to, if you're deep in the weeds of it, to sometimes feel this frustration that during this evolution, we're not making good progress on collaboration. And there's always this feeling of conflict in the Delta. But I think there was general agreement across this panel that, you know, there's a lot of good instances of collaboration that's built into the system through the types of venues that we have, through the various approaches that we have, like even the science conference that bring people together to have these kind of cross-disciplinary, cross-silo, cross-sector, cross-organizational conversations. And I think it's just a really important conversation to continue to have, like, how do we navigate and mitigate some of the conflict through the collaborative processes that are in place? And then how do we ensure that these forms of collaboration are successful over the long term? And there's some good research out there on this. This is something that I work on. So if folks in the Delta want, you know, more information on how to make these processes better, I can send them to folks. Yeah, I think it was a really just interesting panel. We had some folks who had been involved for a long time in the Delta. Sam Loma, who was there, goes back a few decades. I'm looking at Lauren because she's like, yeah, I think he was the, yeah.
40, yeah.
40 decades.
40
yeah.
years.
40 decades. Let's say 40 years. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think Sam also recognized that, yeah, there's been this evolution and we've learned how to do things better. Sometimes it's slow and sometimes it's frustrating, but I don't know, I came away with a fairly positive view, but also a healthy dose of, hey, not everything's perfect. And, you know, it is a complex system. And you have to think of the organizational and institutional structure in the Delta as a complex system, and not just think of it as, you know, there's one single kind of collaborative way of doing things in the Delta. There's all these collaborative venues, and some of them maybe work better than others. And we should be paying attention to them in terms of how they're contributing to our knowledge sharing, to our capacity building, to the science in the Delta, management strategies, those types of things. So yeah, that's what I have right now. I might have more thoughts after a few more days.
Yeah, you've definitely been busy. I forgot to mention, for those who didn't know, that the conference occurred from September 30th to October 2nd, so earlier this week. So I'd like to open the floor for a discussion of what people learned at the conference, and also if they walked away with new ideas for review topics based on this conference. Bob?
I have, I guess, two things I would like to say. One's easy, the other one's a little bit more complex. I thought the conference was, first of all, it was great. It's one that every ISB member should attend in its entirety. It was quite surprising to me. Everybody was there with all their ideas, and they were talking freely about their ideas. And you know, one thing that struck me, the first thing that struck me is there's a lot of innovation and vision and just things going on, whether it's in environmental DNA or it's in technologies or in concepts of how to move ahead. Literally, by attending the conference, you got a vision of what the science enterprise is going to look like. You get these teasers in a way of what the major avenues of science are going to be going forward, even in restoration, whether Dutch slough and some of these others, the kinds of things that folks are involved in. So, I guess I would encourage everybody the next time around is to be there for its entirety. It was quite surprising to me, at least, all the really great things that were going on, and also the kind of the friendliness and openness of the people there that were willing just to sit down and talk to you about things. So anyway, that's number one. Number two is there was one program there that that we had called Healthy Rivers and Watersheds. And we had looked at this as a board, must have been maybe 2 years ago now, under the voluntary agreements for environmental flows. And I can't remember if we wrote anything or whether it was just discussed at our meeting, but we liked the idea of the voluntary concepts, and we didn't have a better suggestion on how to move forward. But Louise Conrad has taken it and turned it into this program, Healthy Rivers and Watersheds, and is really moving it forward. And they're developing a plan that's a lot more comprehensive, I think, than just environmental flows for the rivers, but involving scientists and communities, municipalities, and various ethnic groups, within the Delta. And I would imagine once their plan is finished, I suspect they will probably ask us to review it. That's my assumption, is that they would do such a thing. But I would like to suggest to the board here is that sometime in the next few months, when we meet in person, is we ask Louise Conrad to come and give us an overview of that program, just to keep us informed of what's going on. I think most of you know her. She's very articulate, and I think it would be very timely right now, especially if they come out with a plan in the next year, is that we at least have an understanding of the kinds of things they're trying to do. And I did speak with Louise during the conference, and she said she would be more than happy to come in, whenever we ask. So, but I think it should be an in-person meeting where she comes and we have a chance to interact with her face to face. So those are my two things. Great stuff going on there, and this Healthy Rivers and Watersheds program is something we should be paying attention to. So anyway.
Thank you, Bob. I think Diane wanted to say something right after you.
Yes, this is a bit of a non sequitur. I wasn't able to attend the conference, but I was wondering about the extent to which the future or timeline or whatever the Delta conveyance was discussed in the hallways, or came up in the context of decision-making or uncertainty, or
I didn't see anything on it.
okay, I guess that's the answer.
Did anybody else?
So I just, we keep, it's there on the table at some level, but it you're saying it wasn't a topic of the
No.
discussion.
If I could just give a brief answer, I think people are focusing a lot on the science needed for any kind of management, however the policy comes through. So not DCP specific, or maybe not voluntary agreement specific, but very much thinking about, if we have to manage operations, do we know how to manage the risk to fish and things like that. So there was really quite a lot of good empirical studies. I'll just add this in now because this is related to Louise Conrad's work. Louise Conrad put together a session where they are really testing various ways of improving fish outcomes. And they were measuring, a talk on fish outmigration was particularly impactful to me, looking at whether pulse flows would be successful at improving survival. And so I think what I saw was just really great progress on the science that would be needed for adaptive management.
Thank you.
Tanya?
I was going to agree with Bob on the Healthy Rivers and Watersheds program as a program that we should keep our eyes on, and definitely invite Louise or others to speak to us about it, because I really enjoyed that presentation as well, and it struck me as one that we should be paying attention to as a board. Yeah, and I guess I would add, just in terms of the rest of the conference, I really thought they did a nice job of highlighting several social science related panels and human dimensions panels, and panels related to traditional ecological knowledge and tribal issues. And I haven't been to prior conferences, so I don't know what it looked like in the past, but I did hear that the chatter in the hallways was that, yes, this feels more open to these other disciplines and diverse forms of knowledge. And there were a couple really excellent panels on tribal ecological knowledge that I attended as well, that I thought were really informative, and something that we as a board should also keep in mind as something to kind of keep our eyes on how that's being incorporated into the Delta and into decision-making in the Delta, and probably relates to the EJ paper as well. So, yeah.
Well, thank you.
If you want to go with that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my brain is rather tired right now, but when I think back at the conference, did I forget?
No, I just wanted to ask.
Okay, yeah. Maybe we should go back to this thing, you know? Okay.
Yeah, I just thought, if it's okay, if I could just add some comments as well, since I was there. One of the things I just wanted to make sure folks know, and maybe you did hear this, but the last in-person Bay Delta Science Conference was in 2018. And so because of the pandemic and various other issues. So I think for me, and at least what I observed and heard from my conversations, it was really exciting for folks to get together again, you know, and now in 2024, that's a lot of time. You know, this is usually a biennial conference. So I think, to me, just the mood was so, like Bob said, so positive, so enthusiastic. And I think folks were just so glad to get back together and talk about science and see all these new ways of thinking that are being incorporated now, you know, as Tanya mentioned, with the social science approaches and the tribal TEK. I just thought that was amazing. And no, it was just starting in 2018. People were starting to talk about that. And there was, I thought, a real openness among participants, which I haven't really seen in a science conference. People becoming very vulnerable, and sometimes in what they talked about, you know, not just the head, but the heart. And that was really cool. And with the tribal, there was a whole session. I was going to just read the title session, and this might be one of the ones Tanya was talking about, but weaving together indigenous and Western sciences to restore wild manure, which are Chinook salmon,
Great.
to the Winnemem Wewaket, which is the McCloud River. And they had tribal members there presenting, speaking in their language, including a tribal member from New Zealand, It was amazing. That whole session was really amazing. So, and I guess those were really the main points I wanted to make, that how different but yet how refreshing it was. And I really hope that it's really invigorated the community, I think, and that there are going to be folks really embracing some of these new approaches. You know, it was the decision-making under deep uncertainty, but there were a lot of other talks on structured decision-making, and I learned some terms new to me about value of information, which I think Lisa knows about, but I had never heard of. And I was thinking the same thought of maybe all of you looking at this, what seemed to me almost a spectrum of approaches for decision-making. And just to let you know, and Obey's not on, but when he was asked the question about structured decision-making, that is actually being used quite a bit right now by several venues I'm aware of, and has been for a while, including by the Central Valley Project Improvement Act folks for salmon. So some of these decision-making approaches have been around for a little while, and now there's these kind of new attributes of that being added on, like the value of information and then DMDU. So I think there's lots of opportunities here. And I'm so glad that all of your reviews are fitting right in and feeding in to the situation that we're in now.
Can I finish? Okay, because I might lose my train of thought. Just like three things stuck out to me right now. One was the eDNA session that I know you were at also, Bob. I thought that was very amazing what they can do these days. And they can identify, they just need to take water samples and identify the genes, identify the species that were there or are there. And that science has made a lot of progress. So it'll definitely come into play when we do our monitoring review as an add-on, maybe type of thing. The other thing was also that session that you mentioned on the indigenous knowledge and collaboration. That was amazing what they're doing and how joyful everybody is doing that. I'm sure it took a ton of work to get it this far. That was very interesting. And the other thing, a little sadder maybe, is that the contaminant session was only 1.5 hours long. I've noticed that before. You know, the community who is actually working on contaminants has shrunk enormously in the area. In the 90s, we used to have local meetings with 200 people. And now it's, you know, down to a handful or two, something like that. So anyway, those are just my thoughts. That is money, funding. Yeah.
So Lauren said some of what I was going to say, but I'm going to build on what she said. I think I was surprised to see all the decision science that was going on at the conference. And it really was building on this idea of there is uncertainty, and they were answering questions such as how do we pick which science investments will deliver the most useful information for decision relevant information, and really understanding how uncertainties can impede decisions and what we as scientists can do to help people make better decisions and not be stymied by uncertainty, because the fish can't wait. So, and I think, so I'll segue into something about a new idea, but come back to more decision-making stuff. So I think this potentially leads to a new idea. I know we've already been talking a lot about decision science because of DMDU, and then the climate change workshop will probably take us a little bit into that territory too. But something that someone said on Tanya's panel, that I learned a lot from Tanya's panel, by the way, you know, when do we get to the point where we can effectively model the system by tweaking our models versus when do we have to fundamentally restructure the models? And I think that's a question that the agencies don't necessarily have time to sit down and think about. And that might be something where we could play a bigger role in terms of, you know, this is when the models are going to fail in a fundamental way, something like that. So, but the other thing that really made me think, again, from Tanya's panel, so as someone who does a lot of structured decision-making, to set up a problem in structured decision-making, you have to be very transparent about your goals. And the tribal representatives on Tanya's panel pointed out that those who are out of power may not feel comfortable being completely transparent about their goals. And this is a kind of impediment to sort of this being too one-size-fits-all on these decision-making tools. So I think what I learned is, especially the way some of the structured decision-making is done, it's with a relatively small group. It's not necessarily broadly involving stakeholders. And I think we have to think about ways to still use, you know, decision-making that's going to make sense, be logical, address uncertainties, but not ignore these cultural factors that bring in different risk tolerances and different goals, and really making sure we have the right people in the room. So that's what I really learned. Thanks.
Well, thanks, everybody. That was a great compilation of what we learned. Now, the second question was, do we have any new ideas for review topics? Was anybody inspired by anything? Has anything emerged? No? No?
This is not thought out. It's one of these things that just goes flying off the top of your head, and it's not for this year for sure, maybe not even for next year, but is really thinking about taking a landscape perspective to the Delta. The Delta as a place does not operate alone by itself. It's the sum of its watersheds, of its landscape. And you know, with this new program on, you know, healthy rivers and watersheds, I think it plays into that, is that it's, you know, there's something that we can do here to think about things at the landscape scale. And we certainly have the expertise on the board, both in terms of terrestrial systems and remote sensing, but also in terms of the aquatic environment. What does the landscape do? And this is kind of a unique situation too, because you got the influences of San Francisco Bay coming up the other way, really thinking about it in its totality. Now, and I've been thinking about this for a while, because from a scientific perspective, as a scientist, I can get really excited about this. I can see my way through this and without any problem. It's boom, 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 you know, we can pull this together. But where I'm struggling is understanding or being able to articulate what the lessons might be for management, what would be the pragmatic things that would come out of such a review that would really help improve management of the Delta if we know more about, you know, what's going on upstream or downstream and how that influences the Delta. So anyway, it's just something I've been thinking about. And you know, when I'm out cutting wood or, you know, out mowing the lawn or whatever, you know, that's what I've been thinking about. But if you have any insights on how to, you know, well, one, if you like the idea, that's one thing. Assuming you do like the idea, if you have any suggestions on what some of the pragmatic outcomes might be, you know, I'd be interested in hearing them. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out as a discussion point, and we'll see where it goes down the road. Maybe if it goes somewhere, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too.
And everybody here has been working so hard on the reviews that just were finalized or in the final stages. So I understand. So it takes definitely some maturation of ideas. So it's good that there is a seed implanted already.
Spark.
Yeah.
Spark.
Yeah. And of course, just to mention it, of course, we're going to move ahead with with preparing with preparing the prospectus for the contaminants monitoring review. That's still going on, and I intend to spend some more time on that after this.
So I have a comment.
Yes.
So in the context of potential new activities or, at some point down the road, I like Bob's idea, but I also wanted to put out an idea related to the traditional knowledge and co-production of knowledge. And one of the strengths of the Food Webs workshop at the beginning was bringing in these examples from other places, other systems where food webs have been used effectively, and the history of those food web modeling. And similarly, in this area of engagement in traditional ecological knowledge, this is something that's expanding around the world, and other, in Alaska and New Zealand and Florida and other places where potentially it would be useful to, in the context of the goals of the Delta Stewardship Council, to have an overview and a connection to what can be done in the Delta. That could be a possible, one-day symposium, and could be a way for the board to support this direction going forward.
Sounds like a great idea, Diane.
Yeah, well, this isn't my area, but I have experience. I know we could brainstorm and possibly put something together that would be really helpful, and not a full paper and report in the context of the Food Webs review, but maybe something that's shorter, that is a useful document that could point people and get ideas from these examples.
Or even bringing people in to tell us about it.
Yeah, and I think it would be something that would be good to do in person, because to have some of the speakers come in person, just the way that happened for the Food Webs. Having those people from other systems in the room made a difference. Bob, you're nodding your head. Yeah, so, I don't know if this is redundant with the session that was just at the science conference, but it could be a good opportunity.
Well, thank you for that.
And know about what's happening in the Everglades, and there's a lot of tribal involvement at FIU, for example, and
Work also in the Colorado Basin.
Yeah, also in the Colorado Basin, and so this is something. And how is history, anthropology integrated into these efforts? Yeah.
All right. Well, those are excellent ideas. I have to say, very exciting. Lisa?
So I just wanted to comment. I think this does reflect back on something Bob brought up earlier about the potential to learn from other systems. But I also think there's some good stuff going on in the Delta. So we should probably start with Shoko, who's been really very effective at leading some of these issues here and has made a lot of progress in the past 2 years. So yeah, we shouldn't forget that things are going on, and we need to build on that.
Yeah, and this would be a way to reinforce what is happening and what can happen in the future.
Well, let me ask if there are any public comments at this point.
There are none.
Well, we're coming to the end. Are there any public comments for matters that are not on the agenda, but within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Delta ISB?
There are none.
Well, then I'm coming to the last agenda item, just to give you an outlook on upcoming Delta ISB meetings and what we're going to be talking about. So at the November meeting, which will be virtual, we will get a Delta lead scientist report, Lisa Marie Wyndham Myers, and also a report on her vision, essentially. Traditionally, we provide an opportunity for the Delta lead scientists to share their vision for the Delta Science program after being in the position for a few months. Later, she will have an opportunity for reflections nearer to the end of her term. So we'll hear from her. And then, and this was mentioned before, Dr. Christine Whitcraft of CSU Long Beach is wrapping up a project on early detection and rapid response of invasive species in the Delta. That was motivated by the ISB's 2021 review on invasive species and funded by a DSP directed action request. She will provide a presentation in November. Oh, and by the way, that reminds me that person who calls herself Maven, I think her real name is Chris. She was so enthusiastic about the invasive species review, said that was the best ever and so useful and everything. So I just want to let people know, in case you were involved in that. I wasn't. All right. And then in December, we'll have an in-person meeting. And you know, this is just an idea. Maybe we can arrange for a presentation at that, you know, Louise Conrad, or I was going to find out more about people who could give presentations on contaminants, something like that. Maybe we can do that.
On our radar.
Okay.
Based off Bob's suggestion, and then we're also coordinating a state water project delivery capability report. So if there's any other ideas for in-person presentations, let us know. Because the agenda is wide open.
With that, I hand over to you, Edmund, to review that need follow-up.
Yeah. So today, based off the discussion on the draft tribal and environmental justice paper, the Delta ISB will be pursuing written comments on that draft. Based on the discussion today, individual ISB members should submit comments to staff, and then Lisa Wanger and Tanya Haikala, sorry, I should reverse the order. Tanya Haikala and Lisa Wanger will lead up a draft for discussion, potentially at the November meeting. So keep a lookout on that. Subsidence is still working on a public release of that draft. We'll probably provide a more updated timeline at the November meeting. And then at the Bay Delta Science Conference, the Delta ISB did a little soft launch of 2 products, the Food Web's review and also the seminar synthesis on decision-making under deep uncertainty. We'll be working with the leads to do like an official launch of those reports and thinking about outreach opportunities. And then Bob Nyman already has an upcoming presentation to the council on November 21st with Inga as well. So the idea is that if anyone has any other outreach ideas, feel free to reach out to staff and we'll coordinate with Bob on those ideas. In terms of future planning, we had a lot of great discussions about the Bay Delta Science Conference. We'll invite Louise Conrad to do a presentation on the Healthy Rivers program. Andrew Shores on a statewide project delivery capability report, and any other ideas that you have, Inga, about contaminants, we'll coordinate that. And then we started a little running list of potential ideas for future reviews, such as the traditional knowledge symposium, Bob's landscape perspective, thinking about the Delta as a place. And I think, Lisa, you also mentioned pursuing some ideas about decision sciences and when models fail. And the other thing that occurred today is that Delta ISB discussed the draft prospectus for the climate change symposium that will occur early next year. Based off the feedback today, Anna and Obe will make some modifications and we'll get that out for public comments at this time. Based off the current version of the prospectus, if folks have any ideas of potential speakers, feel free to send them to staff and we'll start a compilation. Anything that anyone would like to add to the to the follow-up?
I think we gave a lot of ideas to Obey and Anna for the climate change workshop. And I would suggest that anything that doesn't fit into the 1-day scope could also potentially be another review. I think there were a lot of good ideas. So didn't want that to get lost.
All right, anything else for the follow-up items? And we don't have any public comments on this agenda item, and I'll turn it back to you.
Very much. And with that, I adjourn the meeting. Thank you for being here.
Just in time to
Oh, it's so hot. I'm so.
It's a warm one.
Yeah.
Can I just, taking advantage of you both being here in person? Yes.